Fresh spring, the herald of love's mighty king, in whose coat armour richly are displayed all sorts of flowers the which on earth do spring, in goodly colours, gloriously arrayed.
The garden of the Royal Horticultural Society at Wisley in Surrey has, since its creation, seen the year's rebirth for over 80 springs. The life that has lain dormant through the harsh frosts and biting northeast winds of winter is about to rear up in splendour, but it's a careful awakening. This part of England is prone to severe frosts through May, so if those goodly colours gloriously arrayed are to be seen and savoured during the rest of the year, the new life's passage into the world must be as gentle as the morning spring light. Our quest for gardening knowledge is unbounded, and the fount of that knowledge is the Royal Horticultural Society, which is respected and revered throughout the world. For nearly 2 centuries, the work of the RHS has informed, instructed and improved gardeners and gardening on every continent. And the sum of that knowledge can be seen at the Society's own garden at Wisley in Surrey. Since 1904, Wisley has been a mecca for gardeners, with over 600,000 visitors a year. Both beautiful in its form and glorious colour, and practical in its work of discovering and advising, Wisley shows the seasons perhaps better than anywhere else.
Spring in the garden, and for all gardeners, is a very exciting time of year, and Wisley is certainly no exception. For me, it is the Alpine Meadow with its dwarf daffodils, the woodland garden with its colourful primulas, and the serried ranks of tulips in the formal areas that gives most pleasure. For others, it is the sowing of seed in the vegetable garden and the mass colour of azaleas and rhododendrons on Batterston Hill. Visitors to Wisley will find a continuously changing kaleidoscope of colour. It is a place to enjoy plants and to learn more about the art and craft of gardening.
The serenity that pervades Wisley in spring belies the sometimes feverish activity that goes on to prepare the garden for the coming months. It's activity that every gardener knows as they clear, prepare and repair the leftovers of winter. The only thing different at Wisley is that it's done on a much bigger scale. When you're next complaining about the long weekends, clearing, digging and pruning, think about Wisley's gardeners. Hundreds of thousands of plants of different species and varieties to be made ready. But the garden shows that the hard work is more than worthwhile. One operation undertaken in spring gives an example of the scale of gardening management and maintenance at Wisley, and also highlights some of the other aspects of the work of the RHS that the public seldom sees. Each year, a limited number of vacancies is made available at Wisley for people seeking practical horticultural experience. The student gardeners take a year-long course with the emphasis on work experience. This is combined with an integrated programme of training and educational activities. Today, however, it's a practical lesson in something no one likes doing.
Okay. And make sure you keep the tip off and make sure as it runs up, don't touch the blade. Keep it running fairly straight.
Spring may be a time of life, but sadly it may also be a time of death. In this case, a Douglas fir, some 40 to 50 years old, has survived its last winter. The tree is infected by fungus and has been further weakened by severe gales. There's only one course open to arborist Mark Burlton. If he leaves the fir in place, there's the chance that the fungus will rot away the base of the tree, and in the next high wind it'll split just above ground level. In its last plunge to earth, the magnificent specimen could bring other healthy trees with it. The fir, Mark decides, has to be felled. With students from the Society's School of Horticulture watching every move, the experts show how to bring down a dangerous giant safely. The fir is ground down to make wood chippings, which are then used later in the season as mulch. From the spring death of this one tree, new life is breathed back into the garden. Spring mulching is something the RHS knows a lot about. It has to. Believe it or not, Wisley, one of our most famous gardens, is in a place where many people might think a garden shouldn't be. The soil is mainly acid sand, which is poor in nutrients and fast draining. That's where mulching comes in. Using the right mulch, bark, either coarse or fine, or well-matured farmyard manure when it's available, can help the young growths in many ways. One of the most important these days is water conservation. The mulch conserves moisture. It also has a beneficial effect on soil temperature and in the suppression of annual weed. Conditions at Wisley are certainly not ideal, but if plants succeed here, they have a good chance almost anywhere. It's hard to believe, as you walk over Battleston Hill in spring, that nature has been so unkind to Wisley in other ways. 3 times since 1965, the elements have battered this part of the country. But no one will forget the fearful damage wreaked at Wisley on the night of October the 16th, 1987. A hurricane devastated Battleston Hill, one of the old and favourite parts of the garden. But nature, they say, heals itself, and while the familiar view from the herbaceous borders, with Scots pines and oaks outlined against the horizon, has gone forever, a visit in spring to this part of Wisley is still an unforgettable experience. Curator Jim Gardner.
Battleston Hill was bought by the Society in the mid-1930s. At that particular time, it was an undulating area of land, and it was basically wooded with Scots pine. Scots pine had been there for approximately 100 years, and these, in fact, were imported as seed from the Harz Mountains in Germany as a potential timber crop for the future. And then came the gales of 1987 and 1990, and at that particular time, something in the region of about 70% of all top cover disappeared, quite literally overnight. And tremendous problems resulted. First one was obviously staff morale. Everyone had to pick themselves off the ground to come in and see what had happened overnight. And then the next thing happened was we had to look at the logistics of cleaning the site up, getting rid of the twisted trees and also the large root butts, and so you could assess what you can actually do here for the future. We're obviously wanting to incorporate more or less continue the same theme, mixed ericaceous themes of planting rhododendrons, azaleas and pieris, and we have been doing that. But also at the same time, a large number of these rhododendrons enjoy sheltered environments in which to flourish in. And so we have to create microclimates back onto this particular site.
To many, the orchid is the pinnacle of decorative construction, brazen in its colour and design, but also soft and fragile, a bewitching mix that has had horticulturalists, both professional and amateur, enthusing for centuries. Despite the interest in orchids shown by the RHS, it wasn't until the 1970s that exotic orchids were featured in a specific glasshouse, with some positioned away from direct light. In the intervening years, the opportunity for people like RHS expert Lucinda Lachlin to work with this most seductive of plants has increased greatly. But while the orchid has about it an air of rare mystery, it belongs to one of the largest families of flowering plants, variously estimated as containing up to 30,000 species and more than 600 genera. The Royal Horticultural Society's Orchid Committee is by a long way the oldest awarding authority in the orchid world. It was set up in 1858. Its awards carry considerable prestige internationally, and these accolades are now a common currency in what's become a vastly enlarged and truly global orchid world. Donations from private collections, and then in 1990s sponsorship to allow an orchid display house to be built, has meant that Wisley now has one of the most important and finest collections to be found anywhere. A living collection of 1,600 different species and cultivars. It goes without saying that this sometimes difficult but always beguiling plant has become a major attraction for visitors to Wisley. But it's not just the exotic that attracts the visitors.
We come into the reasons for pruning.
The advice that can be gained at Wisley about the everyday care of a garden is arguably the best in the world. Every year there's a programme of practical demonstrations available to both members and visitors. Included in these lectures are a whole host of subjects, from the recognition of plant pests, diseases and disorders, or, as here, an introduction to the pruning of roses. Attendance has to be limited at these demonstrations, so everyone gets a fair chance to see and hear everything. Wisley staff are craftsmen and experienced in demonstrating their skills.
they give you an absolute massive flower, these, to start off with. And then once that's gone, then they'll give you secondary flowers, but it won't be as good as the first. Yes, it will be a good display, but it won't be as good as your first display. We'll have a look just a little bit further up.
Andy Hart is using hybrid musk roses for his demonstration. Hybrid musks require 2 prunings, one as shown here, and the second after the first flush of flower. If it's done then, the grower will get a second flush of flower in September.
You can let the branch grow through that side, you can let it grow through this side, upwards. So obviously you don't want it really growing down and then back up again. But so we're not too bad here.
With the flowers already bursting into life, spring is also the time for sowing. Like all great gardens, Wisley receives seed from all 4 corners of the globe. Just as in the 40 years to 1920, known as the golden age of plant collecting, seeds are brought back from expeditions. With such an important pool of future life, it's vital that accurate records are kept and each pot is correctly labelled. Wisley has pioneered much, but certain basic procedures have to be followed. These are true whether you're sowing for a large or a small garden. Wisley's own bedding schemes are often on a grand scale. The basics, however large or small, or indeed whatever you're sowing, are simple. Use a level sowing surface where the compost has been firmed evenly. With all but the finest seeds, compost, grit or vermiculite should be used to cover. It's basic but important advice, and something which the Wisley gardeners of the RHS never forget. Every gardener is interested in acquiring and perpetuating plants, and those at Wisley are no exception. Here in the propagation greenhouse, Ashley Ramsbottom is working with delphinium cuttings from stock plants. Cuttings are taken from the base of the stock plant and here inserted into perlite, an inert granular material which is ideal for rooting. The half pots are stood in a saucer on an open bench. They aren't covered, but the greenhouse is kept at between 55 degrees and 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The cuttings are kept in the greenhouse to root. It's a technique that amateur gardeners will find of interest and could use themselves. Gardening, by its very nature, is ruled by the times of the year. But the master gardeners of Wisley, like Head of Glass Ray Waite, can use nature's seasons for their own advantage. Ray has been at Wisley for over 12 years, and annually he oversees the propagation of many thousands of plants. Here it's chrysanthemums. In spring, Ray's thoughts have already turned to autumn.
We're looking ahead to autumn, and indeed this plant was cut down quite hard to produce cuttings in the spring. This in fact flowered last November and on into December. on taking these nice young shoots that we hope will be able to make root for plants in the autumn. Removing some of the bottom leaves and trimming just below what we call the node. That's where the leaf joins the main stem, because we know that it's at that point where roots will be more readily made. Always use a sharp knife, by the way, when you're making any sort of cutting. You tend to cut yourself much more with a blunt knife than ever you will with a sharp one, because with a blunt knife you're never quite sure when it's going to come through on your hand. Of course, us professionals always cut onto our thumbs as well. Makes most people shudder, but you just get used to the feel of it. Well, there we are. 6 cuttings made, nice and clean. Now into the pot that we prepared, and I am inserting them quite firmly using a gritty compost. That means a compost with plenty of sand in it, and this will help rooting. Put 5 on the outside, 1 in the middle, tap to firm, and once we put that into the propagating case, in about 2 weeks they will be rooted.
The Victorian members of the RHS may not have had the modern technology of today, but they had the ideas that proved the foundation for much of Ray's work at Wisley. He's the first to admit that he and his colleagues still adapt good ideas developed by the gardeners of the last century.
I've got a nice example in here. As I say, we're always looking for adapting their ideas. There's really nothing new in gardening. But here I've got a grapevine growing in a pot as a standard on a little stem, as you see, like a little tree. And of course Victorians actually had these often dotted around the house so that grapes could be taken at will, you know, just as they wanted them. But it's an attractive idea and works very well, and particularly amateurs like it too. And as I say, it's found favour with people in wheelchairs because they too can tend their grapes quite comfortably from their seated position. But I've got one other idea that you might just like to see. It's an idea that I particularly like, and it really is pure Victoriana, and that is a lily of the valley cone. Quite simple to do, in fact. Indeed, lily of the valley forces most times of the year if you so require, but I think rather nice in these duller days. And all we do is to lift the roots, and in fact we put them in the refrigerator for about 2 or 3 weeks in a polythene bag just to really make sure they're chilled, and then we plant them rather like a hanging basket, only upside down, and we then put it in warmth and they push on into flower, and then we cool them back, and that means to say they're going to be in flower a long time. But it's a delightful table centerpiece with a very, very delicious smell, of course.
What the early spring blossom may not deliver in scent, it more than makes up in shape and colour. This is perhaps the perfect sign that spring and the beginning of a new growing year has arrived. But even this idyllic scene hides inherent dangers. The 16-acre fruit field lies beyond Weather Hill. It's aptly named. Spring frosts are the perennial enemy, and the young blossom, half of it apple, is particularly vulnerable. Nowhere more so than at Wisley, where the 670 cultivars make up one of the national collections of apple trees. Nearby, in the model fruit gardens, methods of early season protection of the fruit are demonstrated, methods ancient and modern, from bracken to polythene. Spring is a critical time of the year as the blossom and young shoots develop, Wisley's expert is Hayden Williams.
We've got polythene covers here which are placed over early flowering apricots. Very essential that they are protected against frost, because obviously if the flowers are frosted there's not going to be any fruit. This is a polythene cover over a wooden framework. Very easy, the average handyman can fix that up very readily. Here on the right we've got peaches which have got a top hat on them, primarily to keep water off, but it also acts as a very good frost protection, keeps several degrees of frost away there. We've got here polythenes over nectarines and peaches, polythene cover here, again to keep water off, to prevent peach leaf curl, but a very good secondary factor is that you've got more than adequate frost protection here, 3 to 4 degrees. We can see the flowers have set, they've been hand pollinated with a rabbit's tail on the end of a stick, and we've got quite a good set of peaches developing here. Very old method here. On the fig we've got bracken. The fig brown turkey, winter protected. The bracken was placed on last year before the onset of winter. It's now been thinned to admit light into the shoots, into the young growth here. And also there are the figs which have developed from winter protection. The bracken, if necessary, can be replaced if we think there's going to be a very hard frost. These are all techniques which the amateur can use. Without the netting, without the hessian, without the bracken, we could lose a great potential of fruit yield.
With fruit, there are many different training techniques that can be used. These training techniques vary and depend on what's needed and how much space is available in the garden. Fan training can be highly effective. In this case, it's cherries and apples. However, fan training can be equally effective with peaches, almonds and figs. These trees have been at Wisley for something like 40 years and are a well-known sight. But it's a point that the technique that gave them life, in this case whip and tongue grafting, is seldom attempted by the amateur. Jim Arbery has selected a piece of scion wood taken from red salet, a late-season dessert apple, and has made a sloping cut or whip up to 2 inches in length. Now Jim makes a tongue groove about 1/3 the length from the start of the original cut. The scion is then completed by reducing it to just 3 or 4 buds. It should be remembered that one of the buds must be directly opposite the slanting cut. The scion is then offered up to the stock, and a cut of similar length is made here. It must be of a similar width to that of the scion, so that the vital cambium tissue of both surfaces is in contact. This, ideally, should be against both cut surfaces. The operation can be likened to a surgeon joining 2 sections of artery together. In this case, it enables water and all essential nutrients to flow from the rootstock through to the scion.
They're not as difficult as they look. It's practice, but you get a fairly good take usually. It's important, the tying, that they're tied tightly so you get that good contact. In fact, often the tying's more important than the grafting in some ways, because if it's badly tied it will not take. It's not done by a great many amateurs, but by the keener amateur, certainly. It is a way of producing your own trees. Probably the easier technique of budding, which can be carried out in the summer, can produce a slightly better tree and is slightly easier, I think.
Atop the Alpine Meadow is the Alpine House, which provides visitors with a year-round display of these most popular plants. In the last half of the century, the growing of alpines in old troughs and sinks has become very popular. It takes up little space and can be used on the smallest of patios. Alan Robinson of the Rock Garden uses tufa, a naturally occurring limestone. Tufa is ideally suited for growing techniques, and Alan explains the hows and whys to the RHS students.
Okay, Sharon, how are you going now? Almost finished?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, that's fine. We'll start to plant now. And the first thing we've got to do is to actually make up a slight compost here. Got a nice bit of tufa dust that you've already manufactured out of those holes. And we're just going to add some loam into that, around about a mixture of 50-50, maybe slightly more loam into that. And I'll just moisten that up slightly. It doesn't want to be very wet, but just to take off that real initial dryness. What we need to do with the plants, we need to actually get young, very young plants and grow them actually in situ. It's no point in trying to buy a huge plant and then trying to get it into the tufa. It's really got to actually sort of grow on in there. It's best to use either very young sort of rooted cuttings or just very, very young plants. And this is a Saxifraga longifolia, which is possibly been potted for a few months since the end of last summer. So it's not particularly old, and it should sort of just be adequate sort of root system on there. So first of all, we can just tease that root slightly in there, and I'll just drop a little tiny bit of compost in. And remember, there's no peat or anything in here which will help dry out. It's got to be something which is moisture retentive soil. We just keep prodding that down. Maybe if Doris could go and sort of get us a nice dry paintbrush, I can actually brush the dust away and we can actually finish this off. Thank you, Doris. Now we just start to get rid of this compost on the top of the rock. Just brush it all away, clean the whole thing up, ready to just water this one in. Of course, the actual watering will go on for some time, as it takes quite a few hours to really get this piece of rock soaking wet, and then that will be watered overhead for the rest of the summer now, for several months. Later on we can just use an ordinary watering can to do the whole piece of rock.
The Rock Garden holds a special place in the hearts of springtime visitors. It was opened in 1911, the first major project to be undertaken at Wisley, and it seems to come into its own in the early sunshine. There's ample room on the more exposed outcrops for sun-loving plants, and in April and May it's a treasure trove for those seeking colour and scent. New features are constantly being added, but sections of the rock garden still have a tendency to slip gently downhill. This is caused by Wisley's infamous light sandy soil and underground springs, and like so many parts of the garden, it needs constant renovation. Wisley likes visitors. Every year, over 1 million feet pound the turf in the 200-acre garden. The grass can suffer damage, and like the rock garden, needs care and attention. Paul Chandler explains.
I think we've just got everything on a bigger scale, basically. We've got more feet, more tractors and trailers going over it, and when it rains, that's when the main problems begin, because we don't shut the gardens at any time, unless there's a real trauma. But basically, most damage is done to the grass when it's muddy, very wet, and you get a lot of compaction problems. Basically, we found a form of rubber tyres that are ground up that we can introduce into the ground when we're turfing or seed sowing. The technique was used on dressage arenas, from what I can understand, and they were finding where the horses threw it out onto the grass seemed to be growing a lot better than any other areas. And what I think is happening is the rubber is absorbing the compaction of people walking over it, horses going over it, a lot better, so the air is still allowed to be maintained in the grass, and of course the growth of the grass will respond to that.
Once the rubber fibre has been raked over the surface, it has to be lightly incorporated into the soil and levelled. Whatever new device may be on the market, the Wisley gardeners know you can do a lot worse than a good pat. But it works, and the soil is now ready to accept the turf. Visitors can cause problems, but the garden is there to be seen and would be the less without them. And in spring, the people who come to Wisley have to be as hardy as some of the flowers and plants on display. But there's one thing that can be counted on during a British spring, and that's the uncertainty of the weather. A spring bank holiday crowd, and the annuals amongst them will know, is almost certain to be wet, but they're not deterred. Wisley provides its own microclimates. If it's raining outside, then shelter in the greenhouses and dream of lands far away. Visitors walking through the Pinetum to the most northerly part of the garden will come upon Wisley's 8-acre heather garden. This extensive collection contains some 800 cultivars and is regarded as a national collection under the auspices of the National Council for the Conservation of Plants and Gardens. This organisation, based at Wisley, aims to preserve the unique heritage of British garden plants. Here, Andy Collins, custodian of the heather collection, is clipping off last year's flowers so the plants may generate vigorously for the season ahead. Besides their decorative attraction, the garden demonstrates how heathers can best be cultivated and provides ideas on suitable varieties to grow. In late spring, the Alpine Meadow is already past its best. The yellow swathe of hoop petticoat daffodils has gone, but its legacy, their seed, is vital to Wisley. Collecting seed for inclusion in Wisley's annual seed list is a year-round task. Those that flower in winter or spring are collected early in the season and stored. Besides being an important task for the regeneration of the garden itself, it also provides another service. Nearly 1,000 species and hybrids are included in Wisley's seed list, which attracts not only national but international interest. In 1 year, over 200,000 packets of seed were distributed by the Royal Horticultural Society. For Ray Waite, spring means the early days of preparing the magnificent carpet bedding that is so much a feature of Wisley. Again, the ideas have their roots in the past.
Well, it's really a Victorian idea again. Was taken up, of course, through the years by Parks departments, their commemorative badges, things like that. See it a lot, of course, at the seaside resort departments. At Wisley, of course, we're carrying on the technique, which I know is perhaps not liked by everyone, but it's a technique that I feel quite strongly that we should still be able to keep going with, to show students, and perhaps more importantly, to still keep the plants.
The quest by the RHS for perfection is never-ending. Trials are held throughout the year, not only to find the best of the new cultivars, but also to ensure that established ones are giving of their best. Under glass, polyanthus come under the scrutiny of trials recorder Anne Smith. In front of her, a vast, and to most of us a stunning display of plants. But Anne will be recording flower, leaf and stem characteristics, sturdiness, evenness of colour and resistance to disease. The seeds have been sent in by national and international flower seed companies, as well as professional and amateur growers from all over the world. The RHS is internationally acclaimed as the leading independent trialling institution. The Portsmouth field is the main outdoor trials area of Wisley. It gives you some idea of the scope of the work. It's not always realised that these trials are open to everyone. Amateur gardeners, whether members of the RHS or not, and professional seedsmen are all invited to submit. Subjects are chosen for the year. Here it's tulips, and there's the possibility that an amateur gardener will gain a coveted RHS Award of Garden Merit from the Narcissus and Tulip Committee. Visitors can watch trials in progress, and there are tips to be learned for a wide range of plants.
At this time of year, the plants are growing very vigorously, so they're tying in the plants to the canes. There's 4 canes supporting them, and they put a little string round and do that every couple of weeks and support the plants, otherwise they collapse in a bit of rain and wind. Part of the purpose of the RHS is to promote and educate amateur gardeners, and this is a place where new varieties and new techniques can be seen in operation.
Our pagan forefathers made sacrifices for and rejoiced at the coming of spring. Its arrival meant the end of darkness, cold and need. It was a time of hope for better to come, and if the infant was sturdy and strong and was nurtured well, it would repay tenfold the hard work that was spent on preparing for its coming. At Wisley this year, spring's foothold is secure. But as in all things, its season will fade to make way for an even sturdier child.
Spring, as you will have seen, is a time of great beauty at Wisley, the result of much forward planning and hard work behind the scenes. But even as the visitors enjoyed the spring display, the gardeners' thoughts have turned to the next season, when a bountiful spring turns to the promise of high summer.
Bye.